What is up, people of YouTube? Today's video is actually going to be a little different. We are going to do a deep dive into the Canon EOS R6's menu system. Here we have the video menu system, which it's pretty cool. The camera will know when you're in the video menu system versus the photo menu system. Unlike my Sony cameras, you don't have to set a custom dial to your video settings you want saved. The video settings, like if you switch to video mode, they stay the same, like shutter speed, exposure, stuff like that. They stay the same as when you last had them in video mode, and then if you go to photo mode, it'll stay with the same settings you had last in photo mode. So that's a little thing that I find very, very convenient for fast switching, so I like that. Now right here we have the different modes. So you have manual and you have auto exposure. Obviously, if you are a filmmaker, you want to be in all manual. Now we have the movie recording sizes, full HD. These are all 10-bit, which I will show you how to turn on the 10-bit in just a second. And if you want to unlock 120 frames per second, you just have to hop in here and enable this, and you're quickly in 120 frames per second. Okay, let's go back. Next menu. So here we have some ISO settings, and what I really like is you can set an ISO range, so the max ISO that you want it to be for auto, and then how many options you have available for maximum. Obviously you can do the extended versions, but you might as well just have the maximum be the not extended versions because of the fact that you can pull it out in post. Now for auto exposure, I have it set to auto at 6400. The reason being is 6400 I consider very usable footage, almost indistinguishable from lower ISOs. You do notice a little lower dynamic range, but it's still good enough for quick auto ISO settings. So I don't mess with the HDR settings because personally I don't want to have to deal with setting my display to read those HDR files. This is something that's really cool about the Canon EOS R6 is for video modes. You can mess with the increments to go down to 1/8 a stop. This means that if you are shooting, you can do the aperture to 1/8 of a stop, which is pretty awesome. A lot of these settings are grayed out because of the shoot mode that I'm in, and we'll get into that in just a second. Now on menu 3 we have our white balance settings and our color settings. If you decide you want to use auto white balance, I recommend going to auto white balance white priority. It just looks better. If you do this, it's going to get that orange color under tungsten lights, as it says right here. I would rather add that in post than you deal with it being in there and trying to get that out. You may hear a jingle. That is my dog Thor. He is bouncing around. Now here is how you unlock 10-bit. 10-bit is only available if you have Canon log on, so you definitely want this on. Just be mindful that when Canon log is on, you are getting a different file system, which is .h265, which is pretty compressed and very taxing on your computer. Now I do want to point out, if you use Canon log, that view assist, you want that off, because if you have it on, the LUT that it loads in, or the view assist, just clips the highlights more than you actually have clipped with your log. So I would just make sure that's off. Now this is something that's really cool, is you can actually add lens corrections for your RF lenses and some EF lenses. Usually for photo, I will have these all turned off because I'd rather do it in post and not rely on the camera software. But the fact that I can have it on for video is pretty awesome. I have high ISO noise reduction on just for video because I think the camera does a better job at noise reduction than my software. I don't use HDR movie recording, so we're going to skip this, and then we're going to skip movie self timer, and here we have the image stabilization. So image stabilization by default is on, but if you have a lens that has IS, when you do check the lens IS off, it does turn off the body image stabilization, so that's just something to be mindful of. You can set it so that the shutter button starts recording videos, but There's a dedicated record button up top that I like, so I don't want the shutter to start recording for me. You can cycle zebras on and off, which is really cool. However, if you have zebras on, just know that focus peaking will be turned off. When it comes to the shooting info, I like having the rule of thirds on. It's just a helpful little thing to remind me of composition. Now for shooting info, I do like the histogram. That way you can gauge your exposure, especially if you are not using that view assist. It is going to tell you when your highlights are clipping the best, because zebras are not super reliable on this camera. Even when you set the sensitivity up to the 95%, 90%, 80%, it's just not super reliable, so I'd rather have the histogram. Now on the final menu system for video, you have overheat control, which I turned off because I generally don't want the camera to just automatically turn off because it's hot, because I could potentially miss a shot. But just know, if you have this off, you could damage the sensor over time. This is a setting that you definitely need to toggle if you plan on doing external recording, and this camera doesn't do redundant recording for internal and external. So just know, if you want to record externally, you definitely need to switch over to this, and you are not going to be able to record internally. You have different time codes that you can set up, which are just super useful professional features, but that's pretty much it for video. The touchscreen makes this all super easy to navigate, by the way. I can't use the touchscreen because I'm recording this on an external monitor, which for some reason just turns off the back display, which is just, I don't understand why. Now you have various autofocus modes, but if you have tracking on, it does amazing with eye detection and face detection. You have the option of animals and people in video, which is just amazing. And the animal eye autofocus, it will capture birds in flight, which is just amazing. It does such a good job. I'm truly impressed. You want movie servo autofocus on. That is going to help with the continuous autofocus. Otherwise, you are going to see some performance issues with continuous autofocus. If we go to menu 2, you have manual focus peak settings. It's not available because I have zebras on, like I had said, but if we turn off zebras, we can turn on the peaking, which you have different options of focus peaking. I pick red because it's usually the easiest to see. The focus guide is cool when you're in manual focus. Right here, this little focus box that you get green. It is buggy in these dark contrast situations, but it works great when you're not. It was trying to focus on the curtain. Now you can customize the movie speed, which for a nice rack focus, I find that the -3 looks best and looks most natural for a rack focus, but you can play with this for your different needs. If you have it fast, it's going to not look like a smooth rack focus. I found -3 to just be my favorite. This is how responsive it is to things coming inside or you moving frame, how quickly it's going to try and rack focus. I have it as more responsive because of the eye tracking, and I want it to just track me or whoever I'm filming. I want to track their eyes quickly and just make sure it's staying on it. These settings I haven't really played with, just more options for manual focus right here, but we're gonna skip that. And then how quickly it switches the trapped subjects. This, if you don't want it to switch subjects, you can disable it. So if somebody else walks into frame, it may pick them up, but it depends on how long they're in frame. If you don't want it to pick them up, you just disable this. Got limited autofocus modes. This is just for your quick selection. You don't need to worry about that so much. And then these are just custom dials, and then more custom dials. And then you just have your playback options, which we are going to skip for now. I have airplane mode turned on, that way it can, just save battery. Okay, so here we have the record option. I have separate recording because I don't have redundant recording for video. So if I ever do a photo gig, of course I'm gonna have redundant recording on for photo. But right now for YouTube videos, I don't mind having it go to slot 1 and slot 2. You can set custom file names, simple stuff. This is all self-explanatory. Now for HDMI resolution, I did set it to auto because when it's in 1080p, for some reason, it doesn't record my 4K 60. That could be a different thing. The shutter, you can have it open or closed when you turn off the camera, which is super cool, especially if you're switching lenses. I prefer it closed. Just know this could damage the mechanical shutter, so just be mindful of that. And then it cleans the sensor every time it's turned off, which I love. I haven't had any dust issues so far. And then you have reset camera. Here's the firmware. Make sure you keep up to date with that because Canon's releasing a lot of firmware updates. Here you can choose how many increments it goes up. I always want it to go up as little as possible, so a third of stop is perfect. Lets me fine tune that exposure. Same with ISO. A lot of these are going to be your preferences and just playing with them. Let's hop on over to photo settings. So you have your different photo modes. I choose RAW. You can choose Canon RAW. It makes the files significantly smaller, but I did notice about a stop of dynamic range lost in it. It does an amazing job. It's still way better than recording JPEG, and these are tiny files, but I want as much information as possible so I can recover it in post. You can mess with different aspect ratios. So if I'm shooting a thumbnail, I will switch it to 16:9, or if I'm shooting a time lapse, I'll shoot it in 16:9. Don't worry, if you're shooting RAW, even if you shoot 16:9 aspect ratio, it still records the full data of a 3:2 aspect ratio in Lightroom. Here you have a bunch of auto settings, which you don't really need to worry about. Here are your external speedlight controls. I don't use external speedlights very often, so I haven't played with this at all yet. Nice to see there's a lot of options here. Once again, you have your auto white balance. I like to set it to white priority. For color space, I choose just the standard RGB because that's the industry standard. Picture style, I just pick standard. And then clarity, I don't want the camera increasing any of the clarity. And then lens aberration correction, I have all of these off because I don't want it doing these kinds of corrections, but I don't mind it correcting for chromatic aberrations and some diffraction in the camera because I feel like the camera might do a better job. I'm still playing with this, and I will do an update video if I find that Lightroom does a better job than the camera. I have long exposure noise reduction off because Lightroom I find will do a significantly better job at noise reduction. Once again, high ISO speed noise reduction off. Dust delete data, that is essentially just going to try and remove any dust you have on the lens. I haven't played with that. I haven't had dust on my lens, and that hasn't been an issue for me. You can do focus bracketing, which is super cool because if you want to take, I don't know, several images with different focuses and you want to change the focus point in post, you have this option, which is super cool. Here you have your interval timer, which is for time lapses. Something that's really cool that I like about this is once you have it on and you start your time lapse, it will automatically disable after you shoot that time lapse, so you don't have to worry about accidentally being in time lapse mode when you are switching to photograph stuff. You also want to be mindful though, if you start a time lapse and want to restart a time lapse, you need to turn this back on. Because I was doing a time lapse recently, I had my shutter to electronic. The electronic shutter is 20 frames per second in high frame modes, no matter what. You don't have a choice on that. If you go to high plus, it's 20 frames per second. If you go to high, it's 20 frames per second. If you have electronic first curtain, it's 12 frames per second, I believe max is, and mechanical, it's 12 frames per second max, as long as your battery is over 60%. And it has to be the new Canon battery. This is for, you have a touch shutter, which I hate. I hate this so much. The touch screen, you can tap the back and it'll take a picture. I was doing this with my cheek just constantly and I hated it. image review off because I don't want it showing every time I take a photo the image that I took. I'll just hit the play button if I want to look at the image. This is how you have your viewfinder display. You can have it take up less of the viewfinder. I just want it taking up the full viewfinder. Now, display performance is how quickly you have it refreshing. I have it for smooth, that way I can track birds in flight, but it does eat up the battery a fair amount more. So if you plan on doing single shots or not fast moving subjects, make sure you have power saving on, because smooth will drain your battery. And then in the back, you still can adjust some video settings just in case you are in photo mode and you want to quickly switch to video. Autofocus settings are roughly the same. I disabled continuous autofocus because I kind of, for my shooting style, I like holding the shutter, half pressing it for it to do the continuous autofocus. I found when this was in continuous autofocus, if I half press the shutter, it would interfere with the continuous autofocus a lot. So I made sure that was off. You need movie servo on, and then you have touch to drag settings, which are just amazing. I have it disabled right now because I wanted it to track, and I found that my cheek was pressing up against the screen, and then that was setting a focus point, which stopped it from tracking the eyes. So I disabled this for when I am shooting birds in flight, but it's super convenient for shooting landscapes and stuff like that really quickly, and it's especially useful in video. You have manual focus peaking settings. I have this turned off, but it's cool you have it in photo too. So for the subject tracking, I have it for auto and I'm testing this out, but I found that it's actually really useful at deciding what kind of autofocus it wants to switch to. But you have a bunch of different fast tracking autofocus modes. Auto's been pretty good. Here you have a bunch of lens corrections and custom budding set. Well, there you have a quick look at the Canon menu system. It's pretty easy to figure out, and the touchscreen makes it so easy to navigate. It's super simple coming from my Sony menu system where everything was all over the place. I figured this out in no time at all, and I'm confident you will too. Also, you can change settings on the touchscreen on the back of the camera, which is just awesome. The Q button will let you adjust all these settings. You can mess with the white balance and stuff like that. Just super useful. Obviously, just showing you this menu system doesn't get you familiar with it, but you can see it's pretty easy to navigate, and it's going to make this camera experience enjoyable. If this video helped you in any way, give it a thumbs up. If you guys want to see more on this camera or just more footage from this camera, feel free to subscribe. That way you guys can see all my latest videos. But until next video, I'll see you guys around.